Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our legal webinar on video on demand. We're just going to give it a few more minutes to let everyone join, and then we'll crack on. Right, I think we're there. So thanks for joining. Really good to have so many of you on board and taking an interest in what we've launched. Obviously, you're aware of TicketCo and TicketCo TV. We're a platform that can deliver online content and monetize that event with our ticketing solution. So we've done a legal webinar before on live events. So if you're to live stream an event from a legal standpoint, what do you need to consider? And you can find that on our website. This webinar is mainly focused on video on demand, as we launched video on demand a few weeks ago. And a lot of the questions that are coming back are copyrights, how it differs to normal live streamed events. So we've got a guest speaker on today to help navigate through the tricky world of copyright and legals. So the reason we are here, ultimately, we aren't responsible for the licensing required for your online content and events. But it is a useful topic. And as we said, we've got a legal expert here to help answer some of those questions. Today's webinar will be looking at the differences between digital and live events from a legal point of view, with a deep dive into video on demand specifically. And we have Alistair Cooper from DAC Beachcroft to offer you a viewpoint from a legal perspective. Just a few house rules. The chat will be open, obviously, on the right-hand side if you have any questions. Alistair will stick around after for 5 minutes or so and answer any questions you have. You will receive a copy of the webinar once it's completed as well. So, don't panic if you've missed anything. You'll get a copy afterwards too. So over to Alistair.
Yeah, just to briefly introduce myself. My name's Alistair Cooper. I'm an associate in the technology team at DAC. Very quick overview, we're an international law firm with around 40 specialist tech and media lawyers. So as you can imagine, we're very pleased to be working with TicketCo on this. Obviously in the circumstances, it's a very helpful and practical solution, and yeah, it's very exciting to see things accelerating in this area. As Joe mentioned, the purpose of this talk is to provide a very brief overview of the key things to think about from a legal standpoint in relation to the TicketCo TV video on demand solution. It's obviously worth noting at the outset that we could sit here and talk about the law on this topic for days, with issues ranging from kind of broader regulatory matters like programming content and ad standards regulations, all the way down to tech law issues relating to the underlying systems. So with that in mind, and also I'm kind of conscious it's still Monday, so to preserve everyone's sanity, this talk is very much non-exhaustive. So I've kind of covered the key points only, but I hope you find it useful. And as Joe said, I'll be around for a few minutes afterwards to answer any questions as best I can. So first thing to think about is who are the key parties involved in the model. Firstly, we have what TicketCo refers to as the organizer. In other words, the party creating or putting on the event, creating the content. We then have the content creator themselves, or the artist, clearly an integral part of the whole story. Probably the most important point to think about on this is around the rights that exist in the content which is created, which will ultimately be owned by the content creator, and which they will obviously want to preserve. And I'll come on to that in some more detail shortly. We then, of course, have TicketCo, whose role I will expand on in a moment as well. And finally, we have the organisations known as collecting societies. Hopefully most people who are listening will have come across these organisations. Again, I'll talk in a little more detail about their role shortly. There's still a bit of uncertainty in the market about what each of the different societies do, and kind of how different functions are divvied up. For the purposes of today, we're kind of focusing on the music side of things and music content predominantly for the purpose of today. Obviously, there are lots of different societies doing different things, but for the purpose of today, the main one to be aware of is PRS for music. So again, as I said, just to kind of talk in a bit more detail about TicketCo's role. So yeah, as everyone here will have heard already, the new solution is being powered by TicketCo's pioneering cloud-based platform, which facilitates payment and access to content on demand. TicketCo is essentially acting as an intermediary in the model, giving organisers the tools to do what they usually do, really, apart from letting people onto their premises. So in some senses, from a legal standpoint, there isn't a huge difference between physical concerts, live stream concerts, and video on demand. Obviously, there are kind of different nuances, but broadly speaking, the organizer is still making the content available in public and will need the usual clearances to do so. Obviously, the only real difference is the use of technology. And I'll come on to rights clearances in a bit more detail in a moment. But one point worth flagging at the outset is that, as I say, TicketCo is just acting as an intermediary here, so clearly does not claim any ownership over any of the content that's transmitted. So I'll apologise in advance because I'm going to talk about the law for a couple of minutes now. I promise I'll try not to make it too painful, but it's important to kind of do a quick overview of copyright. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier on, in the video on demand context, there are various rights in the mix which need preserving and protecting. And without going into too much detail, the sort of content, or as lawyers would say, works, which we're talking about here, will usually be automatically protected as copyright, which, as everyone will hopefully know, is a type of IP right. Copyright protection applies to qualifying works automatically, as I say. So unlike other IP rights, which would need to be registered in order to provide protection, like patents, copyright subsists in works automatically, provided they qualify for that protection. Clearly, the main point of copyright protection is to protect against people infringing that copyright. So in this context, making the content available on demand would constitute broadcasting the content in public. And if that's done without permission, then it will be deemed what's known as a primary infringement. I won't bore everyone with the differences between primary and secondary infringement, but primary just means that knowledge and intention are not relevant to liability given the kind of infringement. There are different levels of infringement, but that would constitute primary. So obviously the question is, how do we get around this? And as everyone will hopefully know, someone who owns IP is at liberty to give someone else the ability to use that IP for certain purposes, and they do that by granting a license. So in these circumstances, the organizer will therefore need the appropriate licenses in place for the activities that they're planning, or the service that they're putting out there. And yeah, as I move on to the next slide, I will briefly touch on how all of that works. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier on, these collecting societies play a key role here. I'm hopeful that most people will have come across them, but I thought I would just do a quick summary as to what their role is and how licensing works in practice, because there's still a bit of uncertainty. I guess the reason why they exist, obviously, if businesses wanting to use or broadcast music or other content. As I say, the focus of today is music, but also kind of other content as well. If all businesses wanting to use that content had to obtain licenses from each and every artist or performer, then it's going to be an administrative nightmare. So yeah, this is where collecting societies come in. In the UK, there is a slightly confusing setup. We've got the PRS, or the Performing Rights Society, and Phonographic Performance Limited, who were, up until 2018, completely separate organisations. In 2018, a JV was established so that certain functions of the two could be combined. However, for our purposes, it's just important to know that everything to do with using music online is still administered by PRS. To confuse things even more, PRS is actually a combination of two organisations itself. So it's actually a combination of the Performing Rights Society and something known as the Mechanical Copyright Protection Society. And people may or may not have come across the term mechanical right, which essentially means the right to reproduce a piece of content. However, again, the main thing to know is that PRS are the people to talk to when dealing with content online. So if anyone here has any queries around rights clearances and licenses and that sort of thing, then I'd recommend giving them a call. I've spoken to them fairly recently on a couple of things, and they're helpful and are good at answering different queries. So yeah, I would recommend getting in touch. So yeah, the main role of these societies, and in particular the PRS, is to firstly deal with copyright licensing on behalf of their members, and that will cover the vast majority of commercially released music globally, thanks to global network agreements that the societies have in place. And they also ensure that artists and the like are paid for the use of that content in the form of royalties. Yeah, and as you can imagine, licenses are obtained directly from the PRS. And yeah, as you might expect, there are different levels and types of licenses, different license bands with varying cost levels linked to different levels of revenue derived from the service. So as I say, best to give them a call if you've got any queries around that. And the other obvious area to touch on here is the contractual side of things. So it's probably not necessary for me to talk about specifics here, but it's helpful, I think, to quickly look at things from high level. So yeah, so aside from the license obtained from PRS, which is obviously a contract in and of itself, there are contractual relationships being formed here between TicketCo and the organizer, TicketCo and the end user, and also the organizer and the end user. So yeah, it goes without saying really that all the key players should familiarize themselves with the relevant contract language, also ensuring that it's fit for purpose in the first place, how the various rights are set out, relevant restrictions, and so on. Obviously, when it comes to rights and restrictions, this will be of importance in the context of what the end user is or isn't allowed to do with the content. So, for example, how long the content will be made available for, what the end user is allowed to do with the content, when access to the content will cease. So yeah, whatever the proposed model or proposed service, the contractual wording will just need to be clear around what rights are being granted, for how long, and that sort of thing. Yeah, and I guess clearly in terms of restrictions, it might be difficult to police things in practice, but it's obviously important that it's covered in the contractual documentation and brought to the user's attention. One other final point to consider is audio and visual quality. And I suppose the point to say on this is that there are obviously no guarantees when it comes to providing a service over the internet as to whether or not there will be delays or problems. Problems can obviously arise, at any point down the chain. And there are no kind of guarantees on that. So it's important to be mindful of this in the context of the contract, in terms of providing any commitment as to the quality of the content, so audio, visual, or otherwise. And the contract language will need to take this into account whilst being fair, but making it clear that kind of there are no guarantees that the service will be completely error-free or uninterrupted. So yeah, that concludes the points I wanted to cover. Again, kind of just covering the key issues, but I hope you found that useful. And yeah, I think we've now got a few minutes to answer any questions that have been submitted via the Q&A. But I'll hand back over to Joe briefly. But yeah, thanks for listening.
Great, thanks, Alistair. It's really helpful, and it's really key to understand all of these components in terms of what people are trying to achieve, and obviously we can help you further with that. For organisers out there that aren't currently working with us, we've got a lot of content on our landing page. I'll send an email out after the webinar to all of you as well, and please reach out if you have any questions. Firstly, on legal stuff, we'd happily lean on Alistair to support. Anything around TicketCo TV and how to get going with an event. And if there's anything you want to see from events we've already got going live, I think it's really important, with it's being such a fast-paced movement, that we share information and make sure that everyone's doing it in the correct way. So yeah, thanks for that, Alistair. The chat stays open for 5 or so minutes, so feel free to ask any questions if you have any. But if you are shooting off, thanks for joining, and we'll keep you updated with any other webinars that are coming through.